Stuck in the same cycles, it's not you, it's the system. Let's fix that. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking all about systems, how we think about them, and why we should model them. Welcome to Monologues by Hassie. If you've been consuming self-improvement or productivity content in the past few years, you may have heard a phrase such as systems are better than goals, and which is 100% true. And systems are really important because whether we're aware of it or not, these systems are not just relevant to what we want to achieve in terms of productivity and self-improvement, but we have systems around us, we have systems within us, we are part of systems, be it a physical system, a economic system, a biological system, and all these other different types of systems. They are all around us. So it's very important to think about how these systems work. And a great material I read on the topic of systems thinking is a book called Thinking in Systems, which is a primer on systems thinking by a woman called Donella Meadows. Now, she passed away a long time ago, and her colleagues actually compiled this from a manuscript she wrote. But it's one of those things where you can be very grateful that somebody put pen down to paper and left something that is such a valuable resource. And let's start with the first question, which is, what on earth is a system? So, a system, as Donella defines it in her book, it has three components. It's got an element, something that makes up the system. It's got an interconnection, so something that connects these elements together. And it's got a purpose or function, so the overall behavior that comes out of that system. What's the outcome that system is generating? Now, the interesting thing that Donella says about the purposes of systems, and I think this is a really important one that I want you to, if you take anything from this podcast, take this one key thing out, is that even though a system may have a stated purpose or function, like a label on the front of something you buy in the store, that might not actually be its purpose or its function. The only way to actually observe what the function or what the stated purpose of a system is to observe it over a long period of time. And this is something that we have all around us, because many of the systems that either have been created by, especially the systems that have been created by humans, we will slap labels on things and we'll say this is our system, but it produces a very different result than what we state the system is supposed to do. Key example I might give you is if we look at the factors leading to house price growth, then politicians may say, hey, we have a system in place to make sure that housing is affordable. And they will say this every election cycle for the next 20 to 30 years. But if housing never becomes affordable, then clearly it can't be the actual function of the system to make sure that housing is affordable. So that's just an example. The reason I'm talking about that is it is election year again in Australia. So these topics are all floating up in my head. But that's an example of where the stated purpose of a system isn't actually what's going on, which is why it's really important for us to think about what the system is actually doing and how we can function in that system, and where possible, how we can change the system or change the outcomes of that system. So this is why I thought the book Thinking in Systems was super valuable, because whether you're focusing on how you behave as an economic actor in the broader economy, or how you focus on something like your fitness goals, whether these systems are small, whether they're big, it's very important to think about them. Thinking in systems is especially helpful for complex systems, but as I've found recently by mapping out a lot of the systems in my own life, it is so valuable for, I think, the way we think about goals. So if you read a book like How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big by Scott Adams, he's the guy who kind of popularized thinking in systems over setting goals in terms of self-improvement. If you take a concept like that and you think about the system as deeply as Donella does in Thinking in Systems, and you learn how to map out systems and really understand what is influencing a particular outcome, you become very powerful. I believe you can understand what's happening in the world around us better, but you can also make better decisions and take better actions. I've got some personal examples, which I will be talking about in this podcast, but let's get started. So Let's talk about systems modeling. Now, this is an audio-only podcast, so I'm going to need you to use your imaginations, but when we think about systems, there are a few components. We've got what we have when we're actually diagramming systems is we've got stocks and we've got flows. And the stocks represent the elements and the interconnections are the flows. So we discussed those are two of the three components of a system, the third, of course, being its function or purpose. Now, a stock is an accumulation of a quantity over a particular point in time. It can be a physical quantity or it can be something intangible, right? But it needs to be measurable. So that's the important thing. A stock is simply an accumulation of something that we can measure. A great example is the money in your bank account. That is a stock. So a stock is an accumulation of something. And in the case of a bank account, that is going to be money. If you think about something like maybe your mental health, then maybe your level of confidence is a stock. And because that's an accumulation of something, maybe something is going to happen in your day which reduces your confidence, and maybe something else is going to happen which might increase your confidence. The thing about stocks is they don't change suddenly. So stocks don't change immediately. They are affected by what we call flows, and flows can be inflows or outflows of the stock. So if we look at the bank account example, I want you to imagine if we draw a box, and I want you to imagine a box, and I just want you to put savings inside that box. And you can have an inflow into savings and you can have an outflow into savings. Now, in the financial world, we call that inflow a deposit. You deposit money into your savings account and you withdraw money. And so that is an example of a system, which is obviously part of a much bigger system. All systems are, but we're not going to model the entire universe. We're just focusing on savings in this case. And we have our deposits and our withdrawals, our inflows and our outflows into our savings account. Now, for our system, we can obviously give it a purpose. Maybe the purpose of your savings account is you want to grow it to a particular number. If you have $50,000 in your savings account and you want to get to $100,000, then we have the goal of the system. The goal of the system is to get this savings account to $100,000. Now, if you've currently got 50, what you have is a discrepancy, and that discrepancy will influence your outflow and your inflow. So if my goal is to get to 100,000, I know there's two levers I can really pull. I can decrease my rate of withdrawals, my spending from my savings account, so I can spend less or take less money out of that account. And I can also put more money in. So if I have a broader system which supports me putting more money in and taking less money out, my system will eventually reach its stated purpose of getting to 100,000. Now, once it gets to 100,000, that discrepancy might go. So as money comes in, money will go out. We can now use money above 100,000 for something else. So that's a very small example. And this is very important. When we're thinking about modeling systems, we want to be drawing these stocks, and then we want to be drawing flows. And there can be many stocks in a system. As systems get more complex, you have more stocks. So you have more of these measurable quantities and you have more flows between them. And these stocks and flows can influence each other. So for example, the more money you have, if we go back to the bank account example, if the more money you have in your bank account, the more interest will flow in to your bank account. So there's an interest rate on your bank account, and your interest rate is some percentage multiplied by the amount you have deposited, the amount in that, the stock, the quantity of money in your savings account. And so the more money you have, the more money gets added. And so that's an example of something that is a reinforcing loop, because this is just compound interest in process. The more money you have in the account, the more money you get from interest, which adds to the balance of the account, and that keeps growing over time. And so that's an example of a loop, and that's another important concept, where your money is going to keep growing. So in this case, it's positive to have more money being added because the goal of the system is to get to 100,000. We know that the goal of the system is to have this really healthy amount of savings, right? To help us for a rainy day. And so that's an example of a reinforcing loop. And that's a very good thing. You also have loops which are called balancing loops. So if we look at a system of population, so the number of people being born, births and deaths, deaths are example of something that is going to be a balancing loop. So every time there's a population of people, people are going to die. And deaths is an outflow is actually going to balance the amount of people who live. So for every person who lives, each person can only die once. So every time somebody dies, it simply balances the stock. So when somebody goes, That's probably a very bad example, but that is how a balancing loop works, right? The balancing loop has no real effect on the stock other than decreasing it one at a time. A natural death, so not caused by pandemic, so a natural death, somebody dying of old age, is an example of a balancing loop. Whereas if we have a birth can actually be a reinforcing loop because people can reproduce and create more, and you can have a growing population, which if we look at the population of the planet, that is exactly what's happened. More births lead to more people, which lead to more births. And that is an example of a reinforcing loop. But the balancing loop, in this case, if we just think about natural deaths, we're excluding wars, we're excluding sickness. If we just focus on the pathway where people die of old age, then the balancing loop is much weaker than the reinforcing loop, which is why the human population on planet Earth has been increasing. So despite us having all these illnesses and wars and things which result in deaths at a higher rate than natural deaths, the fact that we have people who can reproduce, it is an example of exponential growth. So there are factors which keep that in check. I think an important concept that we can think about is, whilst we say something like this reinforcing loop causes exponential growth, no system grows exponentially. Every system, there is a finite capacity. And that's an important concept that Donella talks about in Thinking in Systems, that everyone wants infinite growth. We think about the economy, everyone says we want to keep growing and growing and growing. If we look at the reality of any system, that never actually happens. You might get exponential growth for a short period of time, but then there is going to be a factor which influences that. So if we look at human population, if we have too many people, this increases the probability of having things like pandemics, epidemics, so diseases spreading around. And as a result of that, that will curtail the growth of the population. As you have more people, there's more demand for resources, you might have more violence, more wars. So there are factors which come into play. And this is known as a limiting reagent. So a limiting reagent, and that word really excited me when I read it in the book, is because I used to study chemistry, and when we had a chemical equation, we always used to think about limiting reagents. And basically a limiting reagent is the concept that, at least, in chemistry, a limiting reagent is the chemical reactant that is in the lowest quantity is the one that's going to stop the reaction from happening. So if I'm burning hydrogen and oxygen to produce water, then whatever of those molecules I have less of, as per the ratios they need to combine in, that's going to be the limiting reagent. So if I take that to hot dogs, for example, if every hot dog needs 1 sausage and 1 bun, and I have 3 buns and 2 sausages, then my sausages are the limiting reagent. Because even though I could have 3 buns, 4 buns, 5 buns, I only have 2 sausages. So the most hot dogs I can make is 2 hot dogs. So that's what a limiting reagent is. In systems, we always encounter limiting reagents. So when I was talking about human population growth, like I said, things might grow exponentially, but there are going to be factors which come into play. Like exponential growth never actually happens because all systems are going to be constrained. There's no such thing as infinite growth. Once we solve for one limiting reagent, another limiting reagent will appear. That's the other important lesson. So let's say we wanted to eliminate all sicknesses, all illnesses, and we improved healthcare, or we significantly reduced the number of people dying by disease, which we have done. If we look at the 20th century, so the 1900s, there were so many advances in medicine. If we simply look at something like antibiotics, which have saved so many lives. If we look at things like fertilizer, which have enabled us to feed a growing population. Despite having all of these things, so we've removed limiting reagents which were constraining human population growth, but eventually we will run into new limiting reagents, which are unrelated to the ones we've solved in the past. So when we think about every system, there will be a limiting reagent. For example, if your system is to lift more weight every week, and some people who go to the gym have this as a goal, realistically, your body is not capable of infinitely lifting more weight. Otherwise, that would be incredible. If you could just keep compounding over your lifespan, you'd eventually be lifting absolutely ridiculous weights. But everyone knows that's not possible. Even the strongest bodybuilders have a limit. And what are the things that cause them to keep incrementally lifting? It could be something as simple as getting injured. And that's a very common example. So this is a limit to growth. You could be lifting 500 kilos and All of a sudden, you have an injury, your ankle goes out. Maybe you get an unrelated disease, but it means you can't train as much. Maybe something just changes in your life. Maybe your priorities change. And so there is always a limit to growth, and we can't always see it, but there are limiting reagents. So this is an important thing to think about, because it's important to, I think, be very respectful of the way the world works. Because if you expect something to go on forever, one day you are going to be very, very miserable, because that is not the case. And there are many people who are going to tell you, we're going to keep growing forever, for infinity. You know that's not the case. And by understanding that, you can be better prepared to navigate in a world where sometimes, yes, things are going to go backwards. And so that's going to happen. So when we think about systems, even though we have these reinforcing loops, which may cause a particular outcome to happen over and over again, there is going to be something that stops that. So this is a very important concept, right? So even though I have, in that bank account example I gave you, interest is a reinforcing loop, because the more money I have, the more money gets added into my account. But maybe I have an emergency and I need to pull money out of my savings account, and there goes that system, right? So I increased the outflow, I increased the withdrawals, because there's another system which impacted the goal of my savings system. And so that is a normal thing, but buffers are amazing. And by buffers, I mean stocks, because a stock is an accumulation of something. And in the finance world, we call that a buffer. It's good to have buffers because it allows our other systems to have shocks. So if you want to maintain a particular lifestyle and you lose your job, and that means less money is coming out, the fact that you have this accumulation of money in your savings account might mean you get to maintain other things in your system for a limited amount of time, of course, until you run out of savings. And by mapping these systems out and figuring out what's important, it gives you a very good perspective. And so let's talk about a health system and how my health systems have changed. Now, because I've read the book Thinking in Systems, I'm converting to the idea that everything is a system. And so when I look at my old health goals, and I say this with quotation mark, really my goals were part of a very poor system where I wasn't actually achieving what I stated the purpose of the system was meant to be doing. So if I look at how I dealt with my health and fitness goals 3 to 4 years ago, obviously the stated purpose of the system was, I want to be healthy, I want to be stronger, I want to be more athletic. But did the system actually produce these results? And the answer is no, they did not. Because here's what I was doing back then, 3 to 4 years ago. And this is what a lot of people do now, and I've been observing it, is that a lot of people, if we look at the fitness world, will set a goal for something like an event that's coming up. So if I look at the running community, people will look at an event, and let's take City to Surf in Sydney, for example, which is a 14-kilometer race. Beautiful race. If you have the opportunity to do it, please do it. But if we take something like the City to Surf, somebody will say, okay, I've got a 14-kilometer run coming up in August or September, whenever it is, and I'm going to start training for that. I've got 5 months to train for it. And this is my goal. I want to make sure I run as best as I can, whatever that goal may be. Maybe it's a specific time. Maybe it's simply you want to do better than you did last time. Doesn't matter. And they start training for this goal to do City to Surf. And because that's part of their broader health goals. So they said, I want to get healthy and fit. What am I going to do this year? I'm going to run City to Surf. And so they go ahead, they do this training, they run City to Surf, and they get to the peak of that goal. They achieve it. And then what happens? Because that goal no longer exists, they stop putting in the work, or they go into this period of great recovery because they pushed themselves really hard to get there, and now they had to pull all the way back. And that's what I used to do. Things would come up where I'd train for them, where I'd practice for them, but once I actually hit the goal, which was to run City to Surf, I would pull back. And so my health and fitness would actually oscillate. Whilst I was training for the event, my health would improve. But as soon as the event ended, it would get worse. I'd put the weight back on. Sometimes I'd end up even worse off than I was before I started training. So if I looked at my old health system, and I'm using that word because everything is a system, right? Everything is part of a system. Even though I had goals back then, and I say I wasn't using systems thinking 3 to 4 years ago, but I am now. But it was still a system. It was just a very bad system, because the system of having goals for my health actually meant that I wasn't becoming healthy. What the system did produce is it produced an oscillation. It produced highs and lows of where I would get healthy, and then I would fall off the bandwagon, and we would come down and we'd get unhealthy again. We'd put on weight, and when we put on enough weight and we felt unhealthy enough at the lower end, we would feel guilty about not being healthy. But why? Like we said, there's a discrepancy. There's a discrepancy between where we want to be and where we are. And because I stopped training, eventually the negative pressure, the buildup of me being unhealthy would be enough to get me started on the bandwagon. I would pick another event, I would train for it, and that cycle would repeat over and over again. And for a long time, by setting these goals, what I would do is I would create these big oscillations in something like health. And so that's an example of a personal objective or purpose that I would like to achieve, where I previously had a very bad system, because that system would result in me, rather than being very steady at my health goal or continuously working towards it, big oscillations, lots of ups, lots of downs. And now I've changed that. So now I set up a health system because I thought about it very deliberately. I said, you got to have a system for this, and your system's got to be something that you can actually do. A big mistake people make when they start thinking in systems, even without having read the book Thinking in Systems, but when they start reading something like a lot of these productivity and self-improvement content creators out there who say you need to create systems for your goals, is they will create systems which are draconian. They will create systems which are, it's almost like having a micromanager over you. It's so hard to do, and they fall off the bandwagon again. So I think a very important thing when you're creating a system for yourself is make sure the system is something that you can actually do. And so let's take an example of my health system now. A part of my health system now is a set of targets of what I do on a weekly basis. Now, we're using the word system very loosely here. We're kind of deviating from the purpose of Thinking in Systems, the book by Donella Meadows. But what is part of my system for my health is every week I need to run 20 kilometers, I need to swim 2 kilometers, and I need to do 3 body weight workouts. Now, that target is spread out over a week. Now, that behavior, the beauty of having that spread out over a week is it doesn't matter how I split that up. There have been weeks where I've helped friends to train for their marathons, and we've gone and done a half marathon because that's the target they were at. And in that case, I reached my running goal in 1 day. Obviously, that's not sustainable to do every week. Most weeks, I break that 20-kilometer goal and split it up over a number of days of the week, but I do it in a very flexible way. Sometimes I might be running by myself. Sometimes I might be running with a group of friends. I generally always run once a week with my run club. And so that is an example of a system that's very flexible around my lifestyle. Right? So that I've made it easy enough that I can follow. So even though that might sound like a lot for somebody who is getting on their fitness journey, remember, I have built up to this level. So never make a system so draconian and so hard that you can't follow it, either by setting a target that's too high or by being very stringent about when you need to do it. Maybe you say you need to run every single day, you need to run 3 kilometers every day. And if you don't do that, you fail, because that's going to be a system that's going to work against you. Now, when we think about the stocks in that system, for an example, a stock in my health system could simply be the confidence I have in my body. And another stock could be my level of body fat. And obviously I have a target, there's a discrepancy. So if there's a discrepancy between where I want to be, then I will go and do the exercise. I will increase my exercise per week. So like I said, I have a consistent system. Part of that system is also what are my calories, what are my inflows, and what are my outflows of energy? What's the stored energy in my body? So I went ahead and modeled some systems. Now, these things are way too complex for me to talk about. And I'm currently looking at the systems diagram I did for my health, fitness, and energy system. And there's lots of boxes. Let me read out some of the boxes. So the stocks, the accumulations, the things I can measure. Muscle mass, confidence. So that's a psychological stock. That's an interesting one. Even though it's not a physical quantity, if you go to a psychologist's office, they will give you a test called a K10 score or a K10 test. And it's basically a number of questions, and it will work out whether you have depression or anxiety. That's an example of where we take something intangible, something in our head, and we give it a quantitative value. We give it a rating on 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, right? And we come up with a score. So that's an example. Something like confidence is something where you could easily score your confidence on a whatever numerical system you want, and you actually have something you can measure. So if I look at the stocks on the health, fitness, and energy system, I've got muscle mass, confidence, I've got body fat, which I put in brackets as stored energy. I've also got my energy level, and that's also partially physiological. That's how I think about things. I can also give that a score. If you've used any sort of fitness tracker or fitness tracking apps, generally it will ask you, how did you feel on a scale of 1 to 10? That's an example of taking something intangible, something either psychological or physiological, and giving it a rating based on how you feel about it. So these are examples of the stocks that I'm focusing on. And then I looked at different loops. So for example, if I lose more body fat, that increases my confidence, which means I feel better and I want to do more exercise. So when I thought about my systems, I also framed them in a way where I want to focus on reinforcing loops which are positive to my goal of maintaining my health and obviously looking and feeling better. And so it's very important to think in systems when you think about your goals. So this book was particularly valuable. I spent a lot of time after having read this book just mapping out systems. I mapped out systems for my time left on the planet, which is a really simple one. It's a bit sad and a lot of people don't think about this. But when I look at time left on the planet, and this is actually a great example. If you were to pull out a piece of paper and map this system, you can do this as well. This is super easy. You're going to have a box and you're going to write time left in your life. There is no inflow into that box. That is a fixed entity. Yes, there are people trying to live forever for infinity. But as far as I'm concerned, the time left in my life, like if there is a date, and if I believed in something like fate, and that there is a date that I don't know of where I'm going to die someday, then the time I have remaining is a fixed quantity. It is literally a non-renewable resource. And the outflow is simply the passing of time. And that time is an input into everything else I do. Of course, there's many systems that connects to. But when I was mapping out time, I literally just drew the single box. I wrote non-renewable resource. Why? Because there's no way to increase the time I have left on Earth. Again, I'm viewing this in the perspective that there is a fixed date that I will die in the future that I don't know of. And time is simply something that will be spent. It will be passed. So the rate of the passage of time is fixed, and the time I have left in my life, it's both non-renewable and it's also undefined. I don't actually know how much it is. It's like an undiscovered oil well. I'm pulling oil out, but I have no real tool to discover when my time on this planet is going to end. So it was a really good way to visually map that I need to treat time, which is a stock, very preciously. It's an input into every other system I have in my life, and I need to make sure that I'm directing it towards systems which make me happy, which make me healthy, which make me feel fulfilled, which allow me to have a positive impact on the people around me. That's where I need to be using my time. And by mapping it out that way, I was able to make some very important decisions, some hard decisions, but nonetheless, it was a great way to think about things. It's made me more appreciative about how I'm spending my time as well. So it has literally been as simple as that. But if we look at something like time and mapping out a system, it's very meaningful. I also had more complex systems. Like I said, my health, fitness, and energy system is very different to what I was doing 3 to 4 years ago. Previously, I had lots of oscillations. Currently, people who haven't seen me, and sometimes people don't see me for a couple of months, people who've seen me recently have been like, wow, you're looking great. And for me, that means the system's working. It's producing the desired results. By getting that positive feedback as well, it also reinforces everything I'm doing. I'm trying to create systems which compound. But like I said, there's no such thing as infinite growth. I have accepted the reality that there will come a time where I will become sick, I will become injured, there will be something outside my control. And when that happens, I am going to have to adapt that system. Maybe it means those goals and set points change. But remember, my physical health is also like a stock. And there will be things which decrease it. But the beauty of having a stock is, much like in the world of finance and with savings, having good health now and investing in good health now, it's almost like your savings account for when you do have a rainy day and when you do become sick and when you do become old down the track. We're all going to get sick, we're all going to get old, we're all going to die. The question is, what do you want your quality of life to be when you encounter these very tough things that we're all going to encounter as we go through life and as time passes? So that was my health system. If I looked, I had a wealth and investment system. And there I mapped out my investment account, my savings account, and my transaction account. It was really simple, but I wanted to focus on what actions do I want to really maximize. I want to obviously be earning more money, and I want to be putting more money into my savings to hit my savings goal. I also want to be putting more money into my investments. And so I made sure I mapped these things out, right? I really thought about the goals of these systems. And as Donella talks about, with all of these systems, it's important to know that, like I said, we exist in systems outside of ourselves. And in the past, I've had a stated purpose of the system, but that clearly hasn't been what's happening. So by mapping things out, we can kind of figure out if a system isn't working the way it's behaving, sometimes we need to look at the long-term data. On a personal basis, this means at being really retrospective and thinking about what are the outcomes that the systems in my life have been generating for the past, X years of your existence. Have a solid think about it, maybe map it out and figure out where things are going wrong. And then you can think about, okay, great. Maybe I've got an addiction to this and it's causing a problem in these areas of my life. Now, if you've got an addiction, the reason people develop addictions is because there's a reinforcing loop there. They have a substance, it makes them feel good at the cost of something else, but because it made them feel good, they want to do it more, and it keeps going until you've developed dependency on a substance. So anything that gives you positive reinforcement, you're more likely to do it again and again and again. And at the same time, the effect of a drug, for example, is going to be less and less and less. So you just end up having more and more until, of course, that system breaks. A person who is a drug addict cannot infinitely keep taking increasing amounts of drugs. Like we said, all or everything, there will be a limiting reagent to everything. So if we look at somebody who's a drug addict and they take a drug to feel better, and at the same time that the response to that drug goes down, right? Because they're becoming more used to it. They're becoming more accustomed to that drug. So they need larger and larger doses each time. Will eventually get to the point where they overdose. They might die. Maybe something happens in their life with their relationships that forces them to change. The idea that somebody is going to keep being able to increasingly take a larger and larger amount of drug until it approaches infinity never happens. Because generally, either that person gets better, they change their lives, they hit rock bottom and they come back up, or they literally have an overdose and die. So every system has a finite limit. It's very important. Think about that. We live in a economic world where when times are good, people say, governments will say, economists will say, bankers will say, we want to keep growing the economy at X% per annum, forever, infinitely. We want infinite growth. Every company starts out saying that we want to keep growing X and X and X and we want to all be billionaires. But none of this is actually possible. There is always a limit to growth. It's just about what's the limiting reagent and when is that going to happen. So it's a very important thing to keep in your mind. When we think about stocks, some stocks are going to be renewable, other stocks are going to be non-renewable. So if I think about money in a bank account, that is a renewable stock because I can add more in. If I think about oil in an oil well, that is going to be a limited stock or a non-renewable stock. And why is that the case? Because even though there are geological processes and biological processes that help create something like oil and gas, right? Dead plants, animals, forests get trapped. And over time, over many millions of years, we will form these oil, gas, and coal deposits. But these are non-renewable on a shorter time scale, on a human time scale. Why? Because we can deplete these, extract these resources at a far greater rate than what they can be created on a geological time scale. And so that's an example of something that's non-renewable. And so we need to think about these stocks, right? Everything's finite. Is it renewable? Is it non-renewable? It really influences how we behave. It also influences about how we think about the world. So when I think about something, like I said at the start of this podcast, if I think about housing prices in a country like Australia, no matter what our politicians say, if we look at the policies and if we look at house prices as the value of the system or affordability, maybe house price to income ratio, we know that is progressively getting worse. Why? Because houses are increasing at a far higher rate than wages. And why? Because there's many factors which influence that. We can look at the population of Australia that keeps going up. We can look at the amount of housing stock being created. It's not increasing at a rate that is equivalent. So the inflow of housing stock is less than what it needs to be for the inflow of population. If we look at the policies, there are more policies stimulating demand. So the money available to purchase houses keeps going up. One of the governments that are going to be in Australia in our election this year is saying they're going to allow people to take out $50,000 from their retirement accounts to go and purchase properties. So that's going to mean there's more money in the market to buy properties. So all of these factors just end up increasing house prices. So when I hear politicians say, we've got a system in place to tackle this, here's our new policy, rather than take them at their face value, you need to look at how that policy, how that action is going to work in the broader economic system, which controls the affordability of houses in an economy like Australia. So thinking in systems is very, very important. It is changing the way I'm thinking about the world, very literally, because everything I'm doing now, I'm trying to think about it in a system, including the way I deal with people. For example, are you somebody you have very negative interactions with? Eventually, you're just going to stop interacting with these people. In this case, if I choose to be a very negative person and or vice versa, then that interaction is going to stop happening. Why? Because you've got a reinforcing loop, but it's a negative loop. You're going to stop spending time with each other. Whereas a positive version of that could be creating positive interactions. Like I said, if somebody compliments me on my health and well-being, that makes me want to exercise more, or at least keep doing the exercise I'm doing. So I'm reinforcing the behavior of that system. It's getting stronger. The same goes for the way we think about personal relationships and networks. You want to be a positive node in the network. You want to be a node that is connecting, and sometimes being a negative person is going to hurt your chances of doing that. So there's many ways to think about systems and how they are affecting our lives and affecting the lives of the people around us, the countries we live in, the world, the climate. There are so many systems we can think about. Like I said, systems are not merely economic, they're physical, they are chemical, they are biological. There are so many different distinctions of systems. You might be a lawyer, you might be thinking about the legal system. Great. In the legal system, you're going to have stocks and flows and purposes. And you just need to think about how that works for you. So to those of you who are listening to this, and this has been a very long episode, I do realize I've been talking about systems for a while. If this resonated with you, I want you to take out 5 minutes out of your day and map out one system in your life. It could be your finances, it could be fitness, it could be your relationships, it could be the actions you're taking at work to improve an outcome. For example, I'm going into a new career in sales, and I know that I'm going to have to focus on systems which create the results I want for both me, my customers, and the company I work for. And so I'm really going to have to think hard about the actions I'm taking on a daily basis, which are going to contribute to those outcomes. And so, yes, think about a system in your life. Go and map it out. And to those of you listening to this, as always, I wish you great success on all your endeavors. You've just made it through another episode of Monologues by Hassie. It brings me great pleasure to know that you made it to the end. To listen to more episodes, subscribe on your favorite podcast app or visit monologuesbyhassie.com. Thanks for swinging by.